أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. He caught gold fever. In the early 1900s, a man traveled 2,000 miles because rumors spread that gold had been found. Questing for gold is what they called it. When he got there, he staked a claim and started digging. After a few weeks, he found some gold specks, not a lot, but enough to convince him that he needed some machinery to mine the area. So he went back home and raised some money. And before coming back, he convinced his nephew, R.U. Darby, to join him. A third person also came along. When they returned, tests showed they'd found one of the state's most gold-dense plots of land. Understand, if someone found gold, it was like the Wild West. In the California gold rush, 300,000 people from 4 continents swooped down on California in less than a decade. Some spent their life savings or even became indentured servants. Think about that. Some gave up their freedom in hopes of finding gold. And when they got there, it got worse. Questers had to deal with open sewage, kidnapping, and even murder. And if you wanted to eat something, you'd have to think twice. One egg cost $80 in today's currency. It's no wonder that one newspaper called it a highway to insanity. But despite these sacrifices, few found gold. In the Klondike gold rush, only 4% did, which is even harsher when considering that questers mortgaged their homes, survived avalanches, and braved minus 70-degree weather, temperatures so cold that when a man spit, it would crackle and turn to ice before hitting the snow. Gold fever sounds about right. And this itch to find is universal. When we don't understand something, what do? We dig, we ask questions. And it's because our biology craves it. We get a hit of dopamine every time we learn something. It literally feels good to know. But despite this itch to dig, oftentimes we don't even know what we're looking for. Most social media users can better choose if what they read is true or false by flipping a coin instead of trusting their intuition. When false news aligns with one's beliefs, more than 50% of Facebook users don't know they're reading false news. Studies show that most of our headlines are sensational and negative. And sometimes we don't even want to hear good news. One news outlet published positive news for 24 hours and lost 66% of its readership. On the flip side, not knowing can cause panic buying or mental illness. One study showed that most people prefer knowing they're going to get a mild electric shock than not know if they would or would not be shocked. We need to know and we need to ask. So what does Islam say about this? First, let's split questions into 2 types. Questions whose answers make us richer, and questions whose answers make us poorer. Rich questions and poor questions. Islam is generally okay with the first type. We know that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have regular sittings with men and women to address anything on their minds. After Khilafat, the Jamaat's greatest institution is Majlis al-Shura. Our Khulafa have long encouraged letter writing and asking them questions. When the Review of Religions team was here in 2016, Hazur instructed closed-door meetings with Khudam just so questions could be asked freely. The promised Messiah ﷺ says, "I consider it a sign of goodwill and clean-heartedness that if something is not understood, it should be inquired about." Many people harbor doubts, but they neither eliminate such doubts or inquire about them. Consequently, it festers within, which gives rise to further misgivings and destroys the soul. I do not consider it to be in accordance with etiquette that one destroys their soul. Yes, it is inappropriate to keep asking questions about trivial matters. This has been prohibited. But if a very important matter is disturbing your heart, it must be presented and inquired about. But just because a question may be okay, how we ask it is also important. Some think that being bold is a sign of bravery, but that's not always true. The Sahaba fought in battles and faced horrors that would send chills down your spine. But as Hazrat Muslim Maud points out, they would never boldly ask a question to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ or the Khulafa. And the Quran says that after seeing so much fighting amongst humans, the angels were surprised over Allah announcing the advent of Hazrat Adam. Still, they expressed that surprise humbly, admitted their ignorance, and submitted to Allah's decision. And Allah didn't scold them. In fact, the only one who spoke boldly was Iblis. Similarly, Hazur recently said, if a younger person wishes to advise an older person, he should speak with respectfulness and courteousness in mind, not uttering whatever comes to their mind like an ignorant person, and refusing to listen to the other person. And a lot of times this ignorance is couched in trusting untrustworthy people. Similarly, during a gold rush, gold seekers rarely got rich. Instead, the businesses propping up gold fever usually got rich. Boom towns offered hardware shops and restaurants, but also saloons and gambling parlors and places of ill repute, all at the expense of the quester. So as the Quran says, question the credibility of someone telling us to ask a poor question. Do they really have our best interest in mind? Sometimes we can be exploited to create suspicion in our minds with questions like, can the Khalifa make a mistake? And many times people fall for such tricks by first mistaking their own intellect to be on par with that of the Khulafa. As Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, beware of the believer's insight, for indeed he sees with Allah's light. And second, by not knowing that the Khulafa have themselves acknowledged that they can make a mistake. In fact, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did istighfar over 100 times a day. And he also said that he is only a human, and when judging on a dispute, one party may be more eloquent than the other, causing Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to judge in favor of the wrong party. But if that happens, I in fact give him a portion of the fire. Only Allah is perfect, but there's miles of distance between a mistake and a malintent. If you don't know, our Khalifa not only welcomes feedback, but even criticism. Hazur said on MTA recently, if you say that this thing is not good and this is not right, then write to the Khalifa of the time. Ask him why you're giving this decision. Why are you asking us to obey this order or guidance, whereas it is wrong? It is against the teaching of the Quran and Sunnah. Then Khalifa of the time will either prove that his guidance was right, or he will admit that, okay, you are right. Then he will take the decision back. But you have no right to spread and mislead the people on social media. This attitude towards rich questions and poor questions is not unique to the present Khalifa. Take the time when a young man started shouting when Hazrat Umar was about to deliver an address. We won't listen to you until we get the explanation we're owed, he said. People were dumbfounded, but Hazrat Umar calmly asked him to continue. The young man said, the other day I saw the Khalifa wearing 2 pieces of cloth from Baytul Mal while each Muslim was only given one? What right does the Khalifa have to get twice that of an ordinary Muslim? Skeptics will say that if Hazrat Umar was okay with this line of questioning, who can object? First, because of the grace he exhibited, Hazrat Umar is this story's hero, not the questioner. As far as I know, no record of this man's name exists. History doesn't care about him, and neither do we. Second, the young man didn't know what he was talking about, because Hazrat Abdullah ibn Umar stood up and explained, before Hazrat Umar could respond, that he gave this cloth to his father because Hazrat Umar was so tall that one cloth was not enough. Poor questions, poor outcomes. Allegations people raised against the promised Messiah and the Khulafa were just as empty. Hypocrites once asked why the promised Messiah alayhi salam spent langar khana funds on himself. Not only was this a lie, but the promised Messiah alayhi salam would actually take the money people gave him as offerings and spend that on langar. And regarding the Khulafa, have you forgotten about the Laharis and Hazrat Khalifatul Masih I, or Fakhruddin Multani during the Khilafat of Hazrat Muslim Maud? The Rabia Inqilabi or Bilal conspirators during the time of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih III, or Aslam Qureshi during Hazrat Khalifatul Masih IV, or the Shamsuddin conspirators in 2014. Compare the credibility of groups pushing these ideas with that of our Khulafa. A tree is known by the fruit it bears. And if we don't know about these incidents, maybe we should seriously ask if we've done our due diligence. Before going on, it's worth noting here how gold is made. Believe it or not, most of the world's gold is made from earthquakes. The science here is not that important, but what is important is understanding that even a phenomena generally considered destructive, Allah has ensured it has purpose and benefit. The Quran talks about another type of earthquake where believers are violently shaken in chapter 2, verse 215. Here, the root of zulzilu, or violently shaken, can mean an earthquake or fright or to slip. And it's an apt description of trials and discontent we may experience because we insist on asking poor questions. In this context, Hazur recently said, Allah the Almighty's communities constantly remain in a state of battle. Some from among the younger generation become worried too quickly. Those who have experienced similar challenging situations in the past, or who have studied even a bit of history, do not feel anxious in such conditions. But remember, the trials only prove beneficial for those who trust the process. The promised Messiah ﷺ said, "At a time of trial, it is the weak-hearted from among my community for whom I worry." Also during a trial, prayers and steadfastness increase. So don't misread silence as an indication of fear or guilt. As Hazrat Nawab Mubarakah Begum Sahiba said, "Jab nahi bolta banda to khuda bolta hai." When man keeps silent, God speaks for him. Anyone suggesting otherwise is selling you fool's gold. Next, some say it's foolish to put value in faith. Why trust faith when it's unnecessarily cryptic, while the scientific method which has produced the modern world demands precision? Yes, the scientific method has helped produce a lot of the modern world, but the modern world isn't a reflection of moral excellence. If it were, the most successful people in worldly terms would be the most sought after for moral guidance, but they aren't. In fact, their morals and personal lives are a mess. Second, Iman bil ghaib, or faith in the unseen, actually embraces the scientific method. At least 4 times the Quran invites man to produce burhan or proof to defend a viewpoint. And the Quran at least 6 times treats questioning as part of one's spiritual journey. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said the cure for ignorance is inquiry, and the Socratic method is coined after his namesake, Hazrat Socrates, a prophet of God. Third, Iman is purposefully cryptic because it's like a filter to identify those who assess all the facts and then come to a point where they realize that now is the time to trust in Allah. Look at Hazrat Khadija. She wasn't in the cave of Hira. When Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said he received revelation, her prior knowledge and assessment of his character assured her that he was speaking the truth. Fourth, if a person truly practices Iman bil Ghaib, they become smarter and trusting of Allah, thereby positioning themselves to earn a great reward. For example, we all know about Hazrat Ali's services for Islam. But Hazrat Muslim Maud said if Hazrat Ali had knowledge of the unseen and already knew the rewards he would receive for those services, meaning if he didn't have to practice Iman bil Ghaib, then how could his sacrifices be worthy of any reward? I want to revisit R.U. Darby for a moment. After Darby and his group came back and found that gold mine, they went into overdrive. Day after day, they worked and worked, certain that it's only a matter of time before they struck gold. But despite those samples indicating the mine held huge amounts of gold, and despite digging for weeks, no gold was found. Eventually, the uncle told Darby to cut his losses, and he acquiesced. So they sold the machinery to a junk man and went home. See, what happened to Darby is a lot like the other group of people who harshly treat a seeker, thinking Islam disapproves of asking questions. Like Darby's uncle, this group may mean well, but they also don't understand questing because they forget that the Quran says, وَعَمَّ السَّائِلَ فَلَا تَنْهَرْ, and do not scold the seeker. Accordingly, Hazur recently said, before even speaking to them, it is essential to hear them out and let them talk. Elders who scold the youth over something create a negative effect on that youth because he has been publicly humiliated. If one wishes to advise someone, do so with good intention and be mindful of the youth's dignity. So we should realize that sometimes that question we hear is actually a veiled cry for help. Look at when Hazrat Abu Huraira asked about the meaning of an ayat from Hazrat Abu Bakr. Despite Hazrat Abu Bakr answering the question, Hazrat Abu Huraira asked the same question to Hazrat Umar and got the same response. In fact, Hazrat Abu Huraira knew the answer to the question he was asking. This might enrage an outsider. Why is this man repeatedly asking the same question and wasting the time of the Khulafa? What people may not know is at this time, Hazrat Abu Huraira was suffering from such extreme hunger that he would sleep on his stomach and even wrap a stone over his stomach. He was asking this question only because, in his words, I might satisfy my hunger. And we know what happened next. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ overheard and understood the question and met Hazrat Abu Huraira with a smile. He then invited Hazrat Abu Huraira and many other Sahaba to sit with him to drink milk. Rich questions, rich outcomes. Having heard all this, some may argue that I've unfairly categorized some questions as poor, just like I've underplayed the fact that some miners did find gold. Yes, some did. But those successful few trusted the process. They asked the right questions to experts if they could, and were willing to endure every hardship in their quest. And they're not even amongst the mu'mineen. If they're outworking you compared to the efforts you're making for issues you find contentious, isn't that scary? Others may argue that I've been too dismissive of those whose views allegedly defend the Khulafa. Well, the promised Messiah ﷺ severely disapproved of the harsh tarbiyat of the youth. A short-tempered, intolerant, and unreasonable person is not at all suitable for the training of children, he said, and continued, nagging incessantly and persisting on a matter beyond reasonable bounds, i.e. to prohibit and rebuke children on every little thing, is a hidden form of shirk. Again, hearing a poor question doesn't mean you give a poor reply. A balance must be struck. Where the Quran says, وَيْلٌ لِكُلِّ هُمَزَةٍ لُمَزَةٍ, woe to every backbiter and slanderer, it also says, وَعَمَّ السَّائِلَ فَلَا تَنْهَرْ, and do not scold the seeker. Until you trust the process, it's hard to see your endeavors producing a content heart. Yes, some, despite not trusting the process, may earn Allah's fazl, but so did a fraction of the 4% of minors. Are those really the odds you want to stake a claim on? Having struck that balance, one thing remains to find contentment when seeking knowledge: the etiquette of prayer. The promised Messiah ﷺ writes, a supplicant should not get tired and become a prey to despair that nothing will happen. Sometimes it is seen that a prayer is carried on till it is about to be accepted, and then the supplicant gets tired, and the result is failure and frustration. If only R.U. Darby had heard this, because when Darby and his group go back home after selling their equipment to a junk man, the junk man decides, I might as well try and see if that mine has any gold in it. So instead of being an alpha male and just digging, or instead of listening to the naysayers who were mocking him for making the same mistake as Darby, the junk man called in a mining engineer. He called in an expert. After some calculations, the engineer said Darby failed to find the gold because he didn't understand the science behind fault lines, and the mine definitely had gold in it. So the junk man began digging, and he did find gold, lots of it. But guess how far he had to dig? 3 feet. It was only 3 feet. Had Darby asked an expert, instead of making a hasty decision, had he understood Iman bil ghaib, had he dug just 3 more feet, he would have found what he was looking for. At the beginning of the speech, I mentioned that during the quest for gold, a third person accompanied R.U. Darby and his uncle. If you haven't noticed, Darby's initials pose an interesting question. Are you Darby? Well, are you? On a contentious issue, are you someone who insists they're correct, despite not being an expert and not conferring with experts, not asking the right questions, not entertaining the idea that there's another, better explanation out there, not trusting the process? For example, Masih Maud alayhi salam says to pray for someone we're in conflict with for 40 days. Have we done that? If not, maybe we're lazy and the issue we're pushing for isn't that serious. Or maybe we don't believe in salat, which raises other questions. Or are you the type that acts hastily in such matters, ignoring the hadith, haste comes from Satan? And are you thinking right now that all these questions apply to the opposition and not to you? Now, I don't want you to feel bad for Darby, because when he heard about the junk man finding gold, he didn't throw his hands up in despair. Instead, he swore to himself that he'd never be duped by a naysayer again, but also that he trusts the process. So Darby went back to work as an insurance salesman and ended up making over $1 million in sales annually. But that again begs the question, are you Darby? Are you now someone who realizes that they must ignore the naysayers, but also must trust the process? Trust in Iman bil ghaib more than their own intellect. As the promised Messiah ﷺ says in a couplet, "E asir akal khud, but hasti khud kam banaz." O prisoner of your own intellect, be not too proud of yourself. If you can do this, if you can recognize a rich question from a poor question, if you can ask rich questions until the time comes to put your trust in Iman bil ghaib, then your pursuit of knowledge will produce the contentment that you long for. The promised Messiah ﷺ summarized the issue as follows, and with this I close my address. What can mere skepticism avail someone when it leads us only to the conclusion that a thing may either be right or wrong? Your own conjectures cannot lead you to true knowledge. The faint light of reason also stands in need of the living word of God. Blessed are they whose doubts are set at rest. But how can you find this blessing? O seekers of righteousness, if you desire that angels shake hands with you, seek the path of certainty. And if you have not attained that stage, follow the person who has seen God with the eye of certainty.